so I wanted to tell you, just starting with a few days ago, you put up a video, and I believe the title of it was "My Confession," and that
Yeah.
that really was I really enjoyed that, and I think I enjoyed it so much because I related to it so much. And you talked a lot in that video about humble beginnings, and shared some of your background as a kid. And I think probably having feelings like a lot of us, rock and rollers do as we're little guys or gals, growing up, and maybe feeling like we're not so much the one that fits in easily, and maybe we
Yep.
like so. And I know that was definitely my experience, and all that to say, what what was it about music that you think reached out to you at those earliest moments? And I want to get to sort of your needle drop moment in just a minute, where you're talking about, of course, not at the opera, but just in those early days. What do you think it was about the first, your first interactions with music, and the way that it sort of grabbed you?
That's a great question. Yes, obviously, as you mentioned, the night at the opera was a huge deal for me, but it was only a huge deal because my father made music important to me. I'm at home at the moment. We're not at the studio today. It's my wedding anniversary, so my wife's off getting her hair done and everything. And
Well, happy anniversary.
thank you very much. So I stayed at home. So it's interesting because the things I'm passionate about. If you're really super passionate about it, your kids will pick up on it, and if it's actual, there's some validity to it, they'll run with it. And that's what happened with my father. My father was a painter and a sculptor. And so there was art all around the house. And so art was a big part of it, big part of my life. And I did try for a minute to be an artist, but it just didn't click with me in quite the same way. But his love of music was so huge, and it was all classical music predominantly and jazz. And I loved it. But when he gave me, and I was super young, 7 or 8 years old, when he gave me A Night at the Opera as a kid, just blew my mind. I'd never heard anything like it. There was no pop music in our household whatsoever. So you can imagine like just growing up listening to like Brahms and Beethoven and hardcore stuff, Shostakovich, Mussorgsky, Katachurian, like really these really Mahler stuff going on, and then suddenly you've got like, is this the real life? It's like, or I remember being a little kid with these massive big Sony headphones on at my dad's, and just on side one of the record, I remember how fresh and new it was, and just the smell of everything, and then looking at all these pictures of guys with like long hair, and remember they had that colored inner sleeve, and reading all the lyrics and not even knowing what a synthesizer was. So when they wrote no synthesizers were used on this record, I'm like, that's really cool. I don't know what it is, but it's really cool. It must be important because they put it on the record.
Yeah.
Just everything about it, the way it was written in beautifully written almost in like script, and everything about it was a work of art. And that was it. It was immediate. It was like, that's it. I don't know what this is, but I want this. And I think the other thing I always point to when talking about the story is it was pre-puberty.
Yeah.
So, and you understand as a dude, there was no girls. It wasn't like, I need to be in a band because girls will like me. This was just pure, unadulterated love of music. And then, yes, as you were talking about with that video, thanks for bringing it up. There was a couple of things that sort of triggered me to do that. One of the ones was I was flicking through some Instagram posts, and I noticed quite a few people I've had produced like a pronoun for 5 years, and lots of people like to sort of play poor and use it as a manipulative way of like, oh, my life was so tough. And there I am, I'm flicking through and I'm seeing like this beautiful, like 2,500 square foot, completely detached house, and somebody saying about how difficult it was growing up. And I'm like, wow. And I also know that person has like university professor parents with tenure, and you know what that is. That's like a couple $100,000 a year. And I'm just thinking to myself, that is not. But it's like a game people play to be like, I'm so humble and cute. And it's just like the rest of us, regular people like you and I, we just work our butts off, and you know what I mean. And sometimes we work hard enough and smart enough that we're able to feed our families and pay our bills and stuff like that. I've always been, I think one of the advantages of growing up poor in a wealthy area where everybody speaks like me and it's very wealthy, one of the advantages of growing up poor is it gives you this little chip on your shoulder, because you have to work really super hard, because all your friends have like Les Pauls for their first guitar.
Yeah.
And my dad and I built mine, and that's great. I mean, he did most of the work, let's be honest, but we built it because obviously I wanted to be Brian May, number one.
Yeah.
But secondly, we couldn't afford to buy a guitar. There was kids at school who used to call my guitar the breadboard, because what it was is he was in London and he was walking past these rows of Chinese restaurants, and in a skip, he saw this piece of wood poking out in the back of the alley as he's walking down. So he walks down there and pulls out this chopping board. And the guitar had all of these marks on it that were almost impossible to sand out, because it had been used as a chopping board for meats, actually. It took a long time to stain there, try and get all the blood out from the meats in it. And that was the body. And people, but instead of calling it like a chopping board, people used to call my guitar the breadboard. Like, oh, you bought the breadboard, And it was like, joking, but at the same time, it was a gentle reminder that, they had a Strat, and they had a Telecaster, and they had a Les Paul, and I had a guitar I made with my dad, and all of that stuff is what freaking makes us be successful. You know what I mean?
Definitely.
It's that thing that drives us, to be more and more successful, and I welcome it. So it's a blessing, I think, all of those things, to sort of overcome all of those. To be surrounded by success is also fantastic, because you want to emulate it. So I think, all in all, I had a great upbringing, and I was very blessed in that respect.
Well, I think it's so cool to hear the stories about you and your dad working together on your guitar. And here I sit, having just turned 40 years old a few months ago, and my dad and I are actually about to build. My dad just retired from, well, about 3 years ago, retired from our power company. So he's a high-level electrician, almost like a
Wonderful.
like a PhD level electrician. So we're actually going to build my first amp. We're going to do that project together. But I'll share a couple of stories that brought to mind, actually, if that's okay.
Of course, please do.
My for the beginning for me was around 8 years old, and I share this story with guests often, because on this show, and part of the reason it's called The Rocker Life, is I've always felt like there was so much more to discuss, in this part of life than just the musician angle. And you and I both are familiar with that angle, but to me, it's always been interesting. Now that in the role that you're in, you take myself, I'm a full-time professional in finance, and then I switch over, when I get home, I do things like this. And I think in this world of music, there's so many interesting things to sort of break into. But for me, just like you had your moment with A Night at the Opera, for me, it was Destroyer. So I walked into a Kmart, either in my hometown or a few minutes away, and had just started to get a little bit of, like, actually it was $3 a week. That was in 1988. So $3 a week. And if I saved for a month, I could get a cassette tape. They had pretty much stopped printing vinyl at that point. I didn't have easy access to vinyl. So I walked in and bought a cassette tape of Destroyer. And just like you were talking about with your first impressions of Queen, for me, looking at that, I'm thinking, I don't really know if I'm supposed to be entertained or if I'm supposed to be scared, but I think I fit here.
How old were you?
8 years old. I was 8 years old. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think for guys like us, when we fall in love with music, like I said, before puberty, it's the best. Because, I think for me, it was pure escapism. For all of the wonderful picture I paint of having an artistic father, it was also an absolute nightmare, because he was very, how can I best put this? He was very focused on what he was doing. So he was quite insulated from the rest of the world. He wasn't a great communicator. Very much spoke very little. And I think it was a form of escapism for me to have something for myself that I could just kind of enjoy. I mean, it was also a great time because all the bands in that period were just absolutely phenomenal, and everything exploded in the late 70s through the mid 80s. Oh, still some of my favorite music. So it was definitely a blessing. But I hear you on the Kiss Destroyer. It's interesting, of course, because, you know, growing up in England or in the UK in general, we don't really know Kiss. Right. You know, it's not a uniquely American, but almost completely American kind of thing, you know. But of course, when I came here with a band, every musician I knew was a fan of Kiss and Cheap Trick, two bands that I barely knew. Cheap Trick, I'd heard Surrender. You know, that is all right. You know, it's just. And I'd also read about Jack Douglas using them for the original band for Double Fantasy before they hired session players. So I knew who they were, but I didn't really know anything more than a couple of songs. And Kiss were the same thing. I think we knew, I wanna rock and roll all night. You know, that was basically what we knew. Those were our sort of elements. But I came here and they just influenced so many players. Like, because everybody at like 7, 8, 9 years old was like, I want to be in that. I don't know what it is, but that, like you said, I don't know if I should be scared, but it looks like a lot of fun.
No, exactly. And, you know, so you were talking about building your guitar, and I'm sure that made Brian May and Queen as a whole all that much more relatable to you.
Oh, absolutely.
Being on the subject of, you know, sort of growing up, you know, my dad was, before he sort of found his path on his career, he was self-employed up until I was about 7 years old, and we were so broke and so poor. I think it took us another 2 or 3 years to get caught up after he was employed. But he actually, one of the ways we got to spend time together was on the weekends. There was a store nearby, and he was hired to come on the weekends, on Saturdays specifically, and do like repair work and that type of thing. Just so happened that store had a music department. And there was this Flying V sort of knockoff guitar, as generic as a guitar could be, you know, and it went on sale eventually. And I had asked for a guitar for a few years at this point. We compromised on a saxophone, and I had to play saxophone in school for a few years. But I figured anything to get me a little closer, you know, baby steps, right? And then that guitar, lo and behold, it went on sale one weekend, and he brought it home, you know. So I really, just going back to that video and how I related to it. But speaking of A Night at the Opera, I wanted to ask you, just having received that record from your father, and what was the path like after that? You know, with Queen, obviously they made such an impact on you. And what were some of the artists and influences that you picked up just after that? Because I don't know that I've ever heard you talk about that.
No, thank you. It's a great question. The great thing about Queen and that album, to get into that, is that you can go in 55 different directions, because, you know, you've got Bohemian Rhapsody and Prophet Song, which are somewhere in the middle of progressive rock and metal, you know, depending on which way you want to go. So from there, I got into the extremes. Like, suddenly I'm like buying, you know, the first AC/DC records on the more rock side, but I'm also into Genesis. So it's like, it was amazing. But at the same time, the production was so incredible that I also got into ELO and Supertramp. So I remember being like super young and buying Breakfast in America, like, again, like still what do you call them, tweens, but pre that, you know what I mean? Like 8, 9 years old. So I've got Breakfast in America. I've got Out of the Blue by ELO. I've got Genesis, like pretty much everything they did up until that point. But then I'm starting to get into AC/DC. And then as things start to progress, Motorhead, I remember buying Ace of Spades. Now we're talking like a little bit later, like early 80s. You know, so I have Ace of Spades. I have Saxon's first record, Iron Maiden's first record, you know. So it's like, it's a party. You know, I'm moving between great heavy rock, you know, prog stuff, and then like really great production stuff like ELO and Supertramp. So it was a good time. And then, of course, like everybody, you know, I went back to the source. which was for Brian May. It's two places. Rory Gallagher, which
Mhm.
he talks about all the time, an incredible Irish guitar player. So I remember buying the was it Live in Dublin, Live in Ireland one, the one that's with the silver, the chrome cover. What an incredible album. And of course, even more to the source was Jimi Hendrix. So I got everything Jimi Hendrix. There was a point, I think, when I just had a vinyl collection in England. As far as I knew, I had every vinyl album that had ever been put out.
So that led me to ask. I actually was having heard you play. I know you're a very accomplished guitar player, and of course, I know you came over with Star 69, and that was in the late '90s, I believe, when you came to
Yeah, mid-late 90s, yeah.
Mid-late '90s. Okay. The question I was going to ask you was guitar your first instrument? Was it the first?
Oh, yeah,
instrument?
absolutely. I didn't start playing guitar till I was 15, even though I was a huge rock fan. I was a fan of music, so I just had a massive record collection. I mean, massive, hundreds and hundreds of albums. Like I was starting to say before Lucy came over was, I had as far as I knew, I had every Jimi Hendrix record at that point.
Yeah.
I remember I had all the obvious ones, all the bootlegs, all of the other stuff. It was pretty crazy.
I was going to say, about in regards to Jimi Hendrix, what an incredible body of work in a somewhat abbreviated time. I mean,
Yeah.
he left us with so much in such a relatively short period of time.
Insane! Yeah, insane.
Yeah, it's just incredible when you stop and think about it. Speaking of your band, as you transitioned over into America, and you were with was it MCA Records at that time?
Yeah, so in America, it was MCA was the main label, which became Universal, of course. But the label was right. It was a smaller. It was not really small, but it was a subsidiary called Radioactive. They had us. They had the Ramones. They had Live, of course, which just had that album Throwing Copper, which was on like 5 or 6 million copies. So they had a lot of really, really successful bands, and it was run by a guy called Gary Kurfürst. And Gary, if you look him up for those that want to know, his last name is spelled Kurfirst, Kurfürst, and was a hugely successful manager who had managed like the Ramones, had managed Blondie, had managed the Talking Heads, managed Jane's Addiction. He had come up under like Kit Lambert, so it had all this kind of, basically he had a lot of experience working with bands and on all kinds of levels. And he had a good ear, and, people trusted him. And we signed with him and with the label. And it was an interesting ride. I mean, coming to America from England, it was a bit of a culture shock, not for obvious reasons. It was just a culture shock on how the business was done. It was so much more different here in America than it was in England. In England, it was definitely about the best music won, when it came to getting signed and stuff. Here it was all about the business side, and that was a bit of a shock. I'd already been producing and engineering, and I'd recorded my own band's demos that got us signed. The first single that charted, I recorded all of these different things. And, I came here, and then suddenly all of that stuff was taken out of my hands. And, I began to learn pretty quickly that one of the reasons why, at that point, innovation was pretty stifled in America was precisely because of that. They were, there was the same, this happened all the way up through the early 2000s. It was the same 5 or 6 guys or through the 90s, making every single album. You just used to sort of pick up an album, maybe the same producer, the same engineer, the same mixer. And, you remember that period of the mid-90s through the mid-2000s, every record sounded the same.
Exactly.
It was 10 songs, just the same drum sound. It was like the same guitar sound. And it was just getting exhausting. And we kind of got eaten up a little bit by that. And also when I started producing and engineering stuff independently over here, I would bring things to labels. They would sign it. I'd get kicked off the project immediately. But then, of course, they'd want my files and stuff like that. It was just a completely different experience to what we'd had in the UK, in England, where, you know, there's a lot of new people coming and going all the time, new faces coming in, new artists, new producers, new engineers, new writers, and they were coming in because they wanted innovation. If something was new and better, they wanted it out. They wanted to test it. We remixed our first single that I recorded, and nobody liked the new mix, so they went with mine. And that's just a whole different world in England, you know. And when I came here, I don't think anybody even listened to my mix. They just made an assumption that, you know, somebody else is going to re-record everything, you know. And the unfortunate thing is, and you know, you learn as a producer that can stifle things. You know, the original excitement is gone. You know, when you've written that song and it means something, and people are performing it for the first time, and that edge and that kind of flying by the seat of your pants kind of thing, all just disappeared, and now it's kind of, you know, all like, oh, played perfectly to the click, you know, blah blah blah, and just kind of soulless. So yeah, it was a culture shock, and that was the culture shock about coming over here.
Nothing makes you
Pretty
feel
huge.
good about your decision like being kicked off a project and then asked for all your stuff after the fact, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it's happened to so many people, and to be honest, to be positive about it, it's a rite of passage. It's, you know, when you come to America, it's kind of a rite of passage, and a lot of people fall by the wayside, and get disillusioned with the business side of the music business. But you know, you've got people coming in straight out of college, becoming A&R people.
Yeah,
With massive power, you know, absolutely massive power to sign things with huge salaries. Not as bad now, of course, because they can't sustain that kind of stuff. But, you know, having power over, it's just a very lopsided kind of business model. But, you know, in some ways, the old model was good for certain things and bad for others. You know, it's kind of a catch-22.
Yeah.
Because, you know, one of the great things about the traditional music industry was that the gatekeepers that were there, you know, when they believed in something, they would throw money behind it. And it's still my favorite period, like I say, like 75 to 85, you know, with a few exceptions either side, especially when you go back to the late 60s, early 70s. But sonically, so much I love is in that sort of 10-year period. It covers so many great records, so many great artists, you know, and so many of the artists we love made their best albums in that period. You know, I always maintain the technology was kind of at its peak. You know, you had Studer tape machines, you had the birth of SSLs, you had Neves and APIs, wonderful mic collections. People still was close enough to the Beatles to care about writing songs, and the musicality was important. People love to play their instruments. They love merging and different genres of music in there. And innovation was at its peak. Now it's all about the monetization. So it's like, you know, if you wrote a song now and it's a hit, the label wants you to write 9 more that sound exactly the same.
Yeah.
In those days, you know, name any album in that period, and the diversity in genres and songwriting and even singers, bands would let other members have features. You know, it was just such a great time for music, you know. But at the same time, I don't want to be that, sounds like an old guy complaining. I mean, the reality is there is great music out there. You just have to search a little bit harder now.
Right. Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that's exactly, you know, I can go onto iTunes or Spotify or wherever digitally, and once I get to the genre, it's a matter of having to filter and sort of sift through the bins a little bit, so to speak, to find that thing that you're looking for. But like you said, it's still out there. It's a matter of just having to dig a little bit more. And I think that, like you said, to look at the silver lining of that, or look at the upside, I think in a lot of ways you can come across some really cool things, that you can discover some really good stuff that you may not have, you know, 15 years ago, may not have really tried so much, because it was kind of all handed. It was kind of all there in the music store bins to look through, you know. But now, because the playing field has been leveled to a point, we kind of have that luxury of finding some things that are unique, and in some ways, even though we don't have the physical, well, it's still there, but maybe not in the physical product. Although vinyl is, like I told you, when I was a kid, there was, by the time I started buying music, there was no vinyl left really per se. And now I'm getting to start a vinyl collection because
it's amazing. Yeah,
it wasn't there. But to finish my point, just although some of the other physical product may not be there, it's still a matter of we get the privilege of sort of digging through and finding the stuff that really sort of speaks to us. And it's almost like having those experiences as a kid again,
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree entirely. And there's nothing better than picking up a gatefold sleeve and looking at all this beautiful artwork, reading lyrics, finding out everybody that worked on the record. I mean, there was a point when I was about 15, you could ask me about any major record, and I would have been able to go, blah, 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 recorded in the studio by that engineer. I just love that stuff. And I still do. I still love all of it. I just don't quite remember it all. Quite the way when I was obsessed when I was 15. I think it's probably all I thought about when I was 15. Now I have to think about paying bills and things.
Exactly. All that fun stuff we get to deal with now, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'll tell you what, let's have some fun here for a minute before we talk just quickly about Produce Like a Pro. I want to let everyone know where to find you and some of the benefits of Produce Like a Pro as a platform and of course your channel here on YouTube. But just going through 3 or 4 of your credits, beginning with The Fray, of course, the single from The Fray, How to Save a Life, I believe that's the correct title. And spent so much time on Billboard. I believe it was a top 5 single here. And just give me a couple quick highlights as far as your memories go of working on that. What things jump out at you as being just make the highlight reel?
Well, so what happened is I was working, I can't remember what record I was working on, but one of the guys on the record had pulled me aside and played me, it wasn't a cassette, it was probably a cassette, it was transferred to CD, maybe it was a cassette, and we were sitting in his Ford F-150 truck in a parking lot in the studio, and he played me, it wasn't How to Save a Life, it was Cable Car, and I remember just thinking, wow, this is immediate, because it had that, and I just remember being like, that is ridiculously hooky. But Isaac, but Isaac had this voice, I never knew. He just had this rasp where he could take like this simple like poppy melody and give it so much more feeling, and it just was absolutely wonderful. And then, you believed him. All the stuff he was singing about, you believed. And that was just such a wonderful, wonderful thing. So what happened with The Fray was, I'd heard this stuff. I absolutely loved it. I was working on a different record, and they started without me. And then they brought me in back in the end, and we had to recut a whole bunch of stuff. And one of the things, one of the big deals is that they'd recorded the original drums on the single How to Save a Life with hot rods. And it was like, it's a big song. Everybody's listening to it going, this could be a single.
Yeah.
So, but the piano was all soft. Basically, the song had been driven from the drums. They'd recorded essentially live, but the vocal wasn't that compelling, the piano wasn't that compelling, and the drums weren't that compelling. So you were left with the bass track and some guitars. So that's where the re-recording came in. So recutting the drums, I think, was a big, big deal because we had a very, very limited time. Ben, and also it was a bit of an experiment because if it didn't work, remember, see, the album had already come out. This is what a lot of people don't know. The album had come out, and they were like, Cable Car was already on the radio doing pretty well, but they're like, the big, big song, if we can do it properly. And Cable Car I'd done some work on and all this kind of stuff before the album had come out. But when I worked on the single of How to Save a Life, it was already out. So there's actually like the first 70,000 copies of the 4 million sold has a different version of How to Save a Life.
Wow. Okay.
So somebody out there, the 70,000 people they don't probably even realize it, have a different version of How to Save a Life. It's a very different time in those days. So what we did is Ben flew in, the drummer, in the morning, and by about 11:30, he was at my studio, and it was at my old studio. we rented out gear, and there was this massive music festival happening in LA the same day. So like everything was rented out. He didn't fly in with a kit. I told the label, yeah, we have drums. And then he arrives and I'm like, oh. And so I look around and we had a Rogers 24-inch kick that was about this deep.
Yeah.
We had my Supraphonic, my 73 Supraphonic pitted snare.
Oh, wow.
We had no toms. We had a pair of New Beat hi-hats and a Paiste 2002 ride cymbal, and I can't remember what the crash cymbal was. I still own all this stuff. And that's all we had for the drums. So there's no tom fills on the song because there was no toms to do tom fills on. We came up with this groove that was a little bit more aggressive, it's a da 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 da, kind of thing that, and it was a big room, so we were able to get big enough drum sound in the room, and we cut it. I think we cut it by about 12:30. We were tracking. After he arrived at 11:30, we put the drums together, and I can't remember. Maybe he did. I did look at the drums. How many takes did we have? There was quite a few, wasn't there? 7 or 8 takes or something like that. We did a few takes because we tried a couple of different grooves, and then the one that we chose, can't remember what it was called. It was probably like the best of 2 different kinds of grooves put together. And then so we comped it together quickly, and then Ben left, drove to the airport, or was picked up and driven to the airport, and flew home. So it was all turned around in like 3 or 4 hours, back to Colorado, and I drove with the hard drive to Scream Studios on Ventura Boulevard, probably by about 4 p.m. that same day, and gave them to Mark Endert. And Aaron had been cutting the piano in New York because Isaac was there. So the singer was there, was cutting piano, and he uploaded the files. So he uploaded the files. This is back in the days where uploading and downloading files in like 2005 was like, oh my God. So it took an hour to upload it and an hour to download. Now it'd be like zip, zip. We forget 15 years ago, things were slow.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So I drove over with the hard drive, probably 100 gigabyte hard drive or something massive like that, maybe even 50, drove over there, FireWire 400, plugged it in, dragged and dropped the new drum files into the session. Mark pulled them up on the console. There's no drum samples. He just got a mix up of the drum sound. And that night we sent it off to mastering. It was mastered. I think he had the drum sounds up by 6 p.m.
Man.
And I was over there by 4:30, something like that.
It was a pretty hectic day.
Yeah, but it was just a different sort of world. We didn't know. The cable car was doing okay on the radio.
Yeah.
Everybody was happy. The numbers were good. But ultimately, it sold 70,000 albums, which in 2005 or whatever was not a lot of albums. Nowadays that's like, wow, you're the biggest rock band in the world. You sold 70,000 records. But they were doing. The thing was, when the album came out, they were big enough in the tri-state area around sort of Denver to sell 3,000 to 5,000 copies every week, which was really great. They were just selling records consistently. They had a fan base, but they weren't selling like the 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60,000 a week, that it takes to be like massive rock band in those days. But you could see the potential. And then the song got on the radio and was doing okay. And, ultimately it was, the potential was there. And this song, cutting it as a more rocking song with a bigger drum sound, better piano sound, was a big deal. It really took it to the next level. It was easier with Cable Car because Cable Car was the original bass player and the original demo. So those 2 big singles both had to have their own thing. The big Cable Car used the original demo that Aaron had done on his own. So it sort of tracked into that. And then, of course, How to Save a Life was like retracked. And the rest of the record was a fantastic record. So we were able to keep a lot of the original tracking from that as well. But yeah, it was definitely a very rewarding experience, because then, you know, a year later, they're like massive. They've sold millions of records, and, you know, they were a household name, and that song was in every teen movie and every teen TV show ever.
One of the things that I thought as I was reading your credits and I was reading about that track is it had been a while since I'd heard it, even on the radio or anything. One of the crazy things to me was, and I'm not saying this because you're talking with me, but the drums are one of the things that I actually remember the most about that song, which I thought was cool. Just knowing that as we're getting ready to talk today, that you were, you know, instrumental in that part of the record.
Yeah. Well, I know, I appreciate it. That means a lot. I mean, I know I meet a lot of artists that have grown up and they were like 11, 12, 13. That song really spoke to them. And now, like 15 years later, you know, they're making albums. They're like 26 years old, something like that. And they're like, yeah, that song when I was a kid was like such a big song for me. So it's really great. At the time, it was interesting because it didn't explode into suddenly me being the biggest kind of engineer and producer in the world, because they were never considered cool. One of the things about you know, Los Angeles in particular was like there was a lot of like absolute crap being sold that wasn't selling records because it was cool. And like I was saying, you're talking about like A&R people being pretty much fresh out of college kind of age group. And they're always worried about things that were super, super cool.
Yeah.
And you, my daughter's telling me, she promises she'll be quiet. And that's part of the business. It's like, you know, because there's lots of really cool bands, but they don't really pay the bills, you know. It's, you know, we don't have to talk about all the obvious ones, but you know, all those bands that get like front pages of magazines, and you're like, I don't know anybody that likes them, but they're on the front page. Yeah, there was a long period of that, especially during the sort of just before that, the kind of emo period, where they were really pushing emo rock really heavily, but it was not connecting.
Yeah,
they were trying to replace a really vibrant rock scene with bands like Soundgarden and Rage Against the Machine and Queens of the Stone Age and the Foo Fighters in like the mid-late 90s, which was a very vibrant scene with very successful albums, and, you know, and then they were trying to push emo, and it was not connecting with people. You know, a lot of those bands barely sold gold or platinum records at times when, at times when, frankly, you know, you could still sell a lot of records.
Yeah. So I'll skip to the last one because I want to be respectful of your time, but I wouldn't be respectful of my audience if I didn't ask about Space Invader, of course, from Ace Frehley. And knowing that was one of the first albums that had a drummer that wasn't Anton Fig, you know, on the entire album, of course, being Matt Starr. And give me just a couple of quick highlights, a couple of quick memories that jump out at you in working on that album.
I mean, Ace is, where do you want to start? I've got thousands of stories. I mean, Ace, I've told this story one other time, so maybe somebody's heard this, but what I'll tell you the first time. So what happened is, I'm trying to think. Matt Starr was at my old studio rehearsing with a different band, and he asked my business partner, hey, do you know somebody that can mix Ace's record? We're having a hard time getting it mixed, finding the right guy. And my old business partner said, yeah, my business partner, Warren's a great mixer. He just finished Aerosmith and mixed half that album as well as engineering the whole album. You should use him. And he's like, oh, that's cool. I think Ace will be interested to hear what he can do because he's working with Aerosmith. That's right up Ace's alley. And then Ace had asked Jay Ruston if he could mix the album. And Jay's like, I'm super busy. And he's like, well, who would you recommend that's as good as you if you weren't available? And Jay Ruston said, you should work with Warren because he's right up Ace's alley. He just did Aerosmith. And so Matt calls Ace, or Ace calls Matt and goes, what have you found out? And Matt goes, yeah, I think this guy would be really good. Is a guy called Warren Hewitt. He's like, who have you found out? He goes, yeah, this guy here would be really good. It's called Warren Hewitt. So they both got to me from two different settings. Matt had recommended me by meeting my business partner, and Ace had gone to his first choice mixer, who had then referred me as being perfect. So that's how I got the gig. So I get the gig, but I still have to do a test song. So he sends me a song, and he's like, yeah, he's Ace. He's like, yeah, I got to send you the song, and you tell me if you like it. Ace. So he sends me the song, and I think we took a couple of days to mix it. Not like 2 12-hour-long days, don't get me wrong, but I worked on the first day for 5 or 6 hours, got really happy where it was at, printed a mix, and then just kind of put it to bed. Maybe you did some editing, worked on a different song, worked with a different artist, whatever. Next day, I come back, I haven't worked on the song for 12 hours, pull it up on the console, tweak it a little bit, push some solos, do all the things that you do to kind of make it more exciting, a couple of delay effects, and then sent it to him. And then he sent me back some notes. I still don't know if I've got the gig, but he sent me back some notes. And the thing about Ace is, he's been doing this for 40 or 50 years. And so the notes were really straightforward. They're like, turn this up, a bit more 3K on that, turn that down, and pan this over there. Really nice, professional, knows what he's doing notes, which, is like him. Rick Springfield, I've done 3 albums with. Rick's the same way. Rick Springfield's every note is spot on. And if he thinks it's going to be ambiguous, he gives you a musical reference of something amazing, so you know exactly what he's talking about. Yeah. Guys like that, they're musical encyclopedias. They're like us. They love music, so they can reference something that you connect with immediately. Aha, I know what you're saying. So Ace's notes were really good. I did the tweaks. I sent them back to him. And then he calls me and says, yeah, it sounds great. You got the gig, and I'm going to be down tomorrow at 3 p.m. And he was in, I don't know where he is now, off the top of my head, but he was in San Diego. So he said 3 p.m., obviously, because he had to drive for 3 hours. So he turns up at 3 p.m., and he's like, and he was still doing some edits. He had recorded some guitar solos, and he wanted to edit, take the outro from one or whatever. And then he had done some guitar overdubs, and he was going to see what it sounds like in different sections of the song. So I'm thinking all of this, and he's like, yeah, give me a second. And he goes out to his car. No, I am not kidding you. He goes out to his car, and he brings back in his computer, his tower, his screen. And he sets it up on the table behind me, plugs in the hard drive, and does all his own editing, working on Pro Tools, listening to different solos, choosing which solo he likes, And I'm like, the guy's 60 years old, and he's also his own Pro Tools editor. And I don't know what he is now. How old's Ace now? But my point is it was that. I mean, that's pretty huge. Yeah. So that's a big deal, and that was the first day I ever met him.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I love that album. Not only just do I love the songs on that album, the production, Matt's drums, the cover art, Ken Kelly, of course, who did Destroyer.
Yeah, cover art's fantastic.
Yeah, just came out incredible. I think you could have taken that cover. You can't see it up here, but on my wall is the special edition that Ace has signed. And if I ever make it out, if it's okay by you, I'll swing by Spitfire and I'll hand you a gold Sharpie. Maybe you can put your signature on there with Ace's. So
I'd be happy to.
But I love that album. So I thought it would only be appropriate that I ask about some highlights from your time there. But in winding up, let's have you, just for anyone. I always feel like for anyone listening, there may be someone out there who is starting a business, wanting to step into a new endeavor in life, and I think Produce Like a Pro. I've become a member of the Academy. I watch
Amazing.
The vast majority of the videos. And I love it. So would love to have you tell the audience just about Produce Like a Pro and just how they can find you. Of course, they can go to YouTube and search Produce Like a Pro. But and in doing that, if you want to recap your socials, we'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you ever so much. Yeah, well, Produce Like a Pro is designed, we were talking about at the beginning of this, from a perspective of what playground do I want to play in? Uh, I, I like working with the best people in the business, the best musicians, the best producers, the best engineers, the best mixers, the best managers, I like working with the best people in the business. What I don't like is working with the elite. I'm not interested in the wagging finger, I know best BS that we have to live in pretty much everything, let alone music, just life. I have no interest in that whatsoever. As far as I'm concerned, there is no difference between you, me, Eric, you name it. We're
Absolutely.
all just in this working on it. We talk about the internet and bringing everybody together. Well, that's what Produce Like a Pro is about. It's all about everybody being equal and everybody having an opinion. Everybody's a creative individual,
Yeah.
when it comes with, and so that's what it is. It's the great leveler. I don't set people up to be the sound of hits. I don't, if I bring people in and we interview them, it's just to show them as, regular people that love music and are passionate about it. So that's the spirit of Produce Like a Pro. So if you want to come in and join a community where everybody cares about each other, everybody listens to each other, doesn't shoot each other down, that's what we have. It's not pretty unique. It is completely unique. There's nothing else like it. You can go to all the other forums. The other forums encourage elitism. They encourage the experts. The best people I know, Jack Douglas, Shelley Yakos, Jay Messina, three of the greatest producers and engineers that ever lived, that made all of our favorite albums. It's a safe place. It's a safe place to come and help each other out. I really am not into the sort of elitism kind of idea. We're only as good as the artists we work with, and it's our job to get amazing performances out of those people. That really is that's what it's all about.
Well, I appreciate your time, Warren. One thing that I've been around people for a long time, and I've been blessed that my career has put me around a lot of people and in front of a lot of people, and I've been blessed to be able to help a lot of people. And one thing that translates in watching your videos and just I just think you're obviously a gentleman and a class act, and I appreciate you taking time to be on the Rocker Life and just talk shop with us and tell us about Produce Like a Pro. And I hope you'll come back sometime when time permits and it's the right moment to talk about something new. That I hope we can get together and do that. And
I'd love to.
You're actually
anytime. This is a lot of fun.
You're actually going to be one of the first videos on my new YouTube, on the YouTube channel. We're going to be launching YouTube within a couple weeks. We're not on YouTube yet, so you're going to be one of the first videos up, and we'll to be part of that channel. So I'm excited about that.
Right.
And real quick, as we get ready to wrap up, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, I'm excited to see your YouTube channel. Congratulations.
Well,
I encourage all of our members to have YouTube channels. There's successful YouTube channels in music out there teaching stuff that they can't do themselves. So I'm like, come on, let's get some real people on there who, are passionate about music and really want to share stuff. So yeah, I'm all about it. Yeah, I'm excited to see your channel. Congratulations.
I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll recap your socials for you, let everyone know where to find you in the edit. I want to share with you, if I could, real quick, my Queen story. So in the studio / office / room, and it's also my sleeping quarters when I get in trouble with my wife. There's a couch behind me. So when we moved into this home in 2009, we got moved in that weekend, had no furniture. The furniture we had bought was late, you should show up on next week. So we grabbed pillows and blankets, and I reached into my DVD tote, and the one that I pulled out was Queen at Wembley '86. And so that's nice. how we christened our brand new living room in our first home was laying on the floor watching Queen live at Wembley '86. So I thought, especially you telling me it's your anniversary, I thought you'd get a kick out of that.
That's amazing. Yep. Well, you know me, I have any excuse to talk about Queen.
Yeah. And so